Welcome, everyone, to the How to Fly with Guns and Other Weapons TSA Rules webinar here at airsafe.com. I'm your host, Dr. Todd Curtis. And as many of you know, weapons and guns in particular have been in the news lately with respect to registration, should you ban certain types and other types. Well, that has made the public profile of weapons and the TSA and weapons and flying on aircraft a little bit higher. But what hasn't changed are the basic rules when it comes to firearms. The current TSA situation when it comes to firearms is very simple. You're allowed to carry them in checked bags only, with some restrictions. Most knives, as of today, are currently banned from the cabin. Basically, anything with any kind of blade is banned from the cabin, even small steak knives and such. That's going to change in late April 2013, where the TSA will loosen the rules on what you can carry in your carry on bags. TSA currently limits weapons and potential weapons in the cabin, and although the new knife rules will change some of those weapons rules or potential weapons, there's still significant restrictions on what you can carry in the cabin. However, as the case with firearms, there's largely no restriction of what you can carry within checked luggage. Now, one of our guests today is someone who flies extensively and travels extensively, and let me just ask you a question. This is David. Thank you for joining us today. Would you
Mhm.
say that it's easy for you to figure out where the TSA has their rules, or is it hard for you to figure out what the rules are for the TSA?
I think it's hard to figure out the rules, and rules seem to be different at different airports. I mean, just in terms of going through screening for normal screening, not firearms, but rules vary. Some airports, one takes their shoes off, others they don't, and so on.
Well, that's an excellent point. One I've personally lived through myself, and I'm not going to go into the whole reason why shoes are taken off, but I will go into the reasons, well, one of the situations faced by many passengers, not just with flying with firearms, the fact that the rules are often up to the interpretation of the individual screener.
Hmm.
So when it comes to firearms, why are why is this an issue when it comes to TSA and firearms? One is confusion over what the TSA rules are. Now, the TSA will probably point out, oh, we have online brochures and we have the rules laid out on the website that tell you exactly what you can and can't do. They're absolutely correct, but unless you're a bit of a Sherlock Holmes, you may have to hunt and peck and find out exactly where they have those rules and whether those rules are current at the time you're traveling. Rules on other weapons, and weapons I use in a generic sense, vary widely. Things that are recognized as weapons, machetes, martial arts weapons, etc., they're pretty much treated like firearms in that they're not allowed in the cabin. That is, they're not allowed on your person, they're not allowed in carry on bags. They are allowed in check bags. Other things that come into play is that other jurisdictions outside of the TSA may apply. The TSA basically is enforcing federal guidelines when it comes to air safety and the safety of the secured areas of airports. That may be in conflict with local and state laws or national laws if you're outside of the US. That is, once you check the firearm or the weapon in to check luggage and it's in the system, you're okay. Before you check it in, that's a whole different kettle of fish because, again, you could have local rules that are at variance with national rules. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Confusion over what rules to apply is another issue, and it's not just with firearms. As one of our guests pointed out, from airport to airport, from trip to trip, from TSA agent to TSA agent, what is or is not allowed or considered to be banned or restricted may change up to the interpretation of the TSA person. As we'll get into later, unfortunately, unless you can get some sort of decision from a supervisor on the spot, pretty much their decisions are final. You run the risk of having your flight delayed, that is, having yourself delayed and missing your flight, or having valuable items confiscated by the TSA. The risk faced by passengers when they fly with weapons isn't from the weapons themselves as much as it is a risk of arrest or weapons confiscation. For example, if you well, let's go forward a little bit. The rules with respect to the TSA and firearms are as follows. If you have firearms, that is rifle, shotgun, pistol, what have you, it must be in checked luggage. It must be in a hard-sided container. That container must be locked, and you must check in with the airline ahead of time. So obviously the airline is aware that you have that weapon Whatever airline rules happen to apply, they'll apply that to it. Now, this is a very interesting exception. As you may know, for virtually any other kind of bag, check bag, the TSA says, oh, you either keep it unlocked or you use a TSA approved lock so that we can open it up and inspect it. The exception is for hard sided luggage that has firearms within it. It has to be locked, and although they don't specify it's one of the TSA locks that they can open, it's implied that you must have the key. You must be able to open it up when you check in with the airport, at the airline counter. And the TSA at some point will be able to open up that case as well. Now, for our guest, David, I'm going to unmute you for a minute because I may be doing things here that could lead to feedback. And if you do have a question, by all means, go into the question box, which I'll have open, and type something in. And I'll cut in and let you go back on audio. Moving on to the next slide. What can a passenger do? That is, what can you do to prevent the TSA from hassling you unnecessarily, having your valuable items confiscated, or facing arrest and prosecution? The biggest thing is become familiar with the TSA's rules. Granted, the rules are changing, much like the rules on knives and other objects, which are changing in April. And it may be hard to easily get your hands on those rules. Second, take actions to avoid problems. That is, if you're aware of the rules and you take steps to make sure that those rules are being followed, you're okay. And some of the techniques I'll talk about later. If you are traveling for the first time in a long time and you're using some carry-on bags, my suggestion to people is take that carry-on bag that you're going to use the next day or the next week, completely empty the thing. Every nook, every cranny, shake it out and make sure you have nothing in there that could lead to problems. Now, for those of you who shoot for sport and for entertainment, you may happen to leave a couple of bullets in a side pocket in some bag someplace because you just flat out forgot about them. If you accidentally have that in your carry-on bag and you go through security with that and they find bullets in your bag, you can be in for significant delays or even worse. And again, it doesn't matter if it's an innocent mistake or not. You've probably heard many times cases where someone had their concealed weapon and they were walked into the airport. They forgot about it, left it in their bag, left it in their pocket, left it in their purse, and go through security. Suddenly, it's a big consternation. They're under arrest, etc. So again, just being cognizant of where your weapons are, where your ammunition is, and for that matter, even firearms parts. You should be aware where they are. Make absolutely sure they're not in your carry-on bag or in your pocket, because firearm parts, by the way, are treated like firearms in that they must be in checked luggage. And a quick aside here, the only objects that are required to be in a locked, hard-sided container are firearms themselves. If you have firearms parts, reading the TSA rules, you can keep them in a checked bag. They don't have to be in a locked hard-sided container. And the other thing passengers could do is be prepared to deal with problems. Now, there are several kinds of problems that can occur. One of them being, as was mentioned earlier, a misinterpretation of a TSA screener about what is or what is not allowed. If you and the TSA screener disagree on something, without hesitation, ask for a supervisor. Doesn't guarantee it'll go your way, but if there's a problem, rather than arguing with the TSA person, if it looks like it's not going to be resolved within 2 or 3 seconds, call the supervisor. And of course, that also implies that when you're going through screening, whenever possible, allow for extra time. That is, allow for extra time because the lines might be long. Allow for extra time in case there's a problem, you have to go through the line again, or there's a problem and you have to check something that you thought was going to be a carry-on bag. If you go there with ample time to spare, you'll be able to deal with these delays without too much problem. You don't want to be in a position where, well, gee, I either have to dump this $300 item or I miss my flight. Get there early. That takes care of most of the problems. Long term, if it can't be resolved right then and there, either the TSA or the airline or someone else within the airport that somehow or another got in the way of you enjoying your trip, you can take the long approach and do a formal complaint against the appropriate organization. Some of the resources we're going to talk about later on, we've actually detailed the kind of things you can do to prevent these kinds of problems, the kind of things to do to formally complain if they do happen. What weapons concern the TSA? Basically anything that is officially a weapon or that could be used as a weapon. Firearms, realistic replicas of firearms. That is, if it's a plastic M16, looks like an M16, it's treated like a firearm with respect to it's not allowed in the cabin. However, I keep reiterating this point. The only firearms that are required to be in the hard-sided container are actual firearms. Firearms pieces, replica firearms, realistic facsimiles thereof, you can put it in regular check luggage. However, and I have to give you a side warning here, if you have something in your luggage that may be suspicious to the airline and you're checking it in, tell them when you're checking it in. Tell them, hey, I got a plastic, firearm or what have you in here. Knives and other weapons. Again, if it's used to hurt somebody, blackjack, billy club, knife, whatever. If you're into the reenacting of medieval, what have you, at medieval fairs, and you have some weaponry from the merry old age of England, that gets put in check luggage as well. Items that can be used as weapons, again, the TSA goes through an extensive list of items, but basically, if you can hit somebody over the head with it and injure them, it's considered a weapon. Golf clubs, baseball bats, cricket bats, hockey sticks. Although, and I have to say this on an aside, when the rules changed for knives in April, the rules will also change for certain other sports items. For example, you'll be able to take a couple of golf clubs, I think, 2 or 3 golf clubs max. I can't remember the rules right now. You'll be able to take short ceremonial baseball bats, like those souvenir bats you get at the ballpark that are 2 feet or shorter. You can take those on board. Regular baseball bats will still be in checked luggage. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. Become familiar with the TSA rules on what is or what is not allowed. If you have the time, go to the TSA website. If you see a brochure of what's allowed or what's not allowed, and you can print it out, carry it with you when you travel. So if you have an item that is clearly allowed, and the TSA guy says, oh, it's not, or the TSA woman says, no, it's not, whip out their own documentation and say, look, I got this from your website. Here's the URL. Here's the date I got it. It says this is allowed. If you have a problem with that, let me talk to your supervisor. Again, this is easy. Allow them to follow their own rules, and if you're following their own rules, you shouldn't have a problem. The key TSA restrictions when it comes to firearms is what I mentioned earlier. Actual firearms, working firearms, well, they must be unloaded, of course. They must be in locked check bags only. By the way, I didn't explicitly say that firearms should be unloaded, but this is such common sense, it's not funny. For those of you who have firearms and use them for sport, recreation, what have you, it should be unloaded when you travel. Firearm replicas, as I mentioned before, also in check bags. Ammunition in check bags only. Not all ammunition. Some ammunition is allowed. Again, the TSA isn't quite specific on it, but it must be packed accordingly in a proper packaging, etc., so that you don't have them hitting against each other and such. Ammunition doesn't have to be in a locked, hard-sided container. However, if you have a firearm in a locked container and you also want to put your ammunition in there, that's okay. Other weapons, or things that could be a weapon, used as a weapon, in checked bags only. By the way, at this point, I'd like to mention some key exceptions to the weapon rule. That is, right now as we speak, the TSA actually allows small hand tools that are less than 7 inches long to go in the cabin, in your carry-on luggage. Screwdrivers, etc. If it's 7 inches or shorter, you can carry it. Now, of course, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to take a 6-inch screwdriver and use it as a weapon, but I'm just saying, those are the rules. They don't necessarily have to make sense, but they are what they are. Notable TSA exceptions. Firearm accessories are allowed. Some firearm accessories are allowed in the cabin. So if you have a scope, a rifle scope, you can carry that in the cabin. Other accessories, not actual parts of the weapon itself, but accessories you can carry in the cabin. Reading between the lines, if you have a cleaning kit and you have liquid containers less than 100 milliliter and 3.4 ounces, which is a standard for liquids. If it's not hazardous, caustic, etc., and you have small tools for repairing or cleaning your weapon, you can probably take that in the cabin, no problem. The smaller knife allowance, I'll go into that in some detail in a minute. It's going to happen next month, in April 2013. Non-realistic weapons are allowed in the cabin. This is what I call the Disneyland rule. If your kid goes to Disneyland, they have a Dayglow orange space gun. They're going to let you take that onto the passenger cabin. They're realistic. They're not too crazy at the TSA. Many other potential weapons are allowed in the cabin. I talked to you about the small tool exemption. You can also take knitting needles, rounded edge small scissors. There's a whole host of things where if you look at the brochures that the TSA has about what's allowed and what's not allowed, it's like, anyone with any imagination, if they really wanted to hurt someone, could hurt someone with this stuff. But I'm just saying, the rules are the rules. They don't always make sense, but there are a whole class of things that are potential weapons that are allowed, but you just have to be very careful. Review the rules when you fly. If you're not sure, review them again. Okay, basic TSA firearms laws and rules. I talked about the hard-sided cases. You have to follow three sets of rules: the TSA's rules, the airline's rules, and again, if you're taking more than one airline, let's say you're changing planes going from airline A to airline B, check the rules on both airlines. And you also have to be familiar with the local laws where you're traveling from, where you're traveling to, and any interim place where you might be in an airport, especially an overseas airport, changing planes, and you may have to be inspected again. Remember, no matter what the excuse, if you carry a weapon or ammunition through a checkpoint, whether by accident or design, it could lead to your arrest and the confiscation of your weapons. And typically, if the TSA confiscates your weapon and later on you find out and they find out, oh, we really shouldn't have confiscated this, chances are you'll never recover that weapon. You can or that item. You can certainly put in for a refund from the TSA. But this is another side issue. The TSA confiscates something of yours. You get no compensation unless there was an error on their part. They confiscated it and it was not a confiscatable item and they're in the wrong, and you can document that. Otherwise, they take your firearms part, they take your firearms, they take your ammunition. That's it. You'll never see it again. And moving on to our next slide. Bear with me here. The TSA has been a source of, let's just say a source of humor and conversation about policy for over a decade now. I'm not going to go into that, but I will go into this. They do have a purpose. Their purpose is to provide security for the passengers, for the cargo, for the people who work in the airport, and the people who work in airplanes, flight attendants, cabin crews, flight attendants, pilots, maintenance, etc. They screen passengers and they screen baggage. That's their primary goal. They do not have law enforcement power. That is, the TSA will not arrest you if you do something illegal at the checkpoint. They don't have those powers. However, they work closely with law enforcement at every airport, and if there's a problem and you've broken a law, they'll turn you over to the local authorities. In general, they can control access of people and goods, and they have the power to, on the spot, make decisions about that access and control. Whether those decisions are right or wrong, they do have that power, and as most of you who fly know, they'll exercise it with little or no prompting. When it comes to TSA screening, this is a generic sort of thing, not necessarily related to firearms, but they do a certain set of basic things. They check your travel documents, they screen passengers, they screen carry-on items, and they screen checked items. Now, once you turn in your item at the airport counter, it goes through a process behind the walls. Sometimes they x-ray, sometimes they will open up a check bag, go through it. If they open up your check bag for whatever reason, they typically leave a note inside saying, this is a TSA, we opened your bag. So you know that happened. As for your hard-sided container, again, they're treated somewhat differently because the airlines will know immediately there's a weapon in there. And very likely the airline and the TSA will inspect that hard-sided package. If you happen to have a firearm in an improper package, very likely it won't be accepted by the airline. And if it is, it may be confiscated by the TSA if they find a weapon in a non-approved package. The most likely firearms problems will come during a secondary screening. That is, you get screened at the passenger screening station, and for whatever reason, either something in your carry-on bag or something in your person triggers an alarm. If it's your bag, let's say there is something in the x-ray that looks unusual, they'll open up the bag and inspect to see what's there. If it turns out you have something that is inappropriate for a carry-on bag, they'll confiscate it. And of course, if it's a weapon, they might confiscate it and arrest you. And other restricted items, that is, allowed to be taken on the plane but not in carry-on bags, if they find it during secondary screening, you'll be asked to either dispose of the item or deal with it some other way. For example, go back to the airline counter, put it in a checked bag and check it through, or go outside in the terminal, figure out a way to mail it to your destination and get it sent there. The other likely problem at the screening area is loss, damage, and theft of items. Again, if you have valuable items in your carry-on, rifle scope, other items that are valuable and are instantly recognizable, then they're at risk of being lost or stolen if they have to open up those carry-on bags because of a secondary screening. My advice to you is if you have anything in your carry-on bags that could trigger the alarm because it's large and metallic or oddly shaped, whatever, tell the TSA people ahead of time, tell them where it is in the bag, have them look at it before they send it through, and you'll avoid an unexpected secondary screening. Risk reduction strategies, again, this is generic, not just with firearms. The best thing to do to avoid risk is avoid any potential problem. For example, if you can easily buy the ammunition where you're going, and you probably need a whole lot more ammunition than you're willing to pack in your bag, don't fly with ammunition. Take the firearm, not the ammunition. If you have items that you can put in check bags, if you're already going to check a bag anyway, for example, you're already going to check the firearm, and there's some items that you think, well, I can go carry on or I can go checked. And they're metallic, they might cause a shadow on the screen, and they're not all that valuable. Hey, pack them in check luggage with the firearm. Minimize your problem at the passenger screening station. You can make the problems less likely by having fewer of those items, whatever those items may be. You can, for example, if you can put 2 weapons in one case as opposed to 2 weapons in 2 different cases, put 2 pistols in one case. Make the effects less severe should they happen. For example, if you have an extremely valuable item, small, you can carry it in carry-on, and it's no big problem for you to do so, it's usually better to carry it in a carry-on than to put it in check bags, because carry-on, it's under your control the whole time. Check bags, you don't know what kind of nonsense they're going to do with bags behind closed doors. It could be opened up. Somebody could steal items from it. Yes, TSA has been having issues over the last few years with some of their employees stealing things out of check bags. It happens. And the other thing you can do is have a plan for dealing with problems. Now, some of the resources we're going to talk about later have detailed step-by-step procedures for how do you go about dealing with a complaint. What you should do if you get to your location and your check bag doesn't come out on the conveyor belt. I keep mentioning these resources, and here they are. Over the last few months, I've written 3 guides. Some of the material is common to all 3, but some are specific to each book. The airsafe.com Baggage and Security Guide, the airsafe.com Airline Complaint Guide, and the airsafe.com Family Air Travel Guide. One or all 3 of these might be of use to you. For example, if you're traveling with a family members rather, especially if there's multiple family members, they're not as well versed on rules as you are. There's some things that you should do if you're traveling with families. Let me give you some suggestions that will make it less likely things will happen bad to you. Remember what I said earlier about if you have a carry-on bag you haven't used in a while, totally empty every pocket there. That's also a rule I use with children and teenagers. It's like, if you're flying with me, you've got a backpack or something, I want everything, and I mean everything, out of the bag before you pack it up again. Because if you spot something that shouldn't be there, and the kid is, well, not smart enough to know what they should know, well, that's your time to step in and keep problems from happening at the screening station. The complaint guide, self-explanatory, it talks about complaint processes, both for lost and damaged items, for improper behavior by TSA personnel, with specific phone numbers, email addresses, and places you can send complaints. The baggage and security guide goes into rather extensive detail about the security process, and I believe that book, or I'm almost sure that book, I have to look at it again, has a chapter on flying with firearms. That chapter will have to be changed because, like I said before, as of April, some of the rules on knives will change. And I just went over what the guides covered. And by the way, if you're a subscriber to the mailing list, a new subscriber, you should have a link in one of the first or second emails that takes you to the page where that can be gotten. And if you're an ongoing subscriber to airsafe.com, every email has a link to that same resources page. If you don't see that in your email, or if you just want to contact me directly, you're just here today for the webinar, by all means, send me an email, todd@airsafemedia.com, and I'll be sure to get those to you. And dealing with delays at check-in, similar to the kind of suggestions I gave for the screening area. Allow for more time. If you think there may be a problem, allow for more time. If you think there could be a lot of people flying and at that time you're going to the airport, allow for more time. If you think your hard-sided case or your other weapons and material you have packed might cause some problems with the airline, allow for more time. Properly pack whatever you have. I mean, for obvious reasons, you want to pack it so it's not going to be jostled around and damaged. And you also want to make sure you do basic things like keep it unloaded when you put it in the bag. Getting back to the secondary screenings, if you have a problem with the TSA, that is, they ask you to do a secondary screening, my suggestion to you is to comply with their instructions, even though they might not make a lot of sense, even though there may be no justification for it in your mind. Just follow their instructions. And if you have something that's causing a problem in your carry-on bag, don't hesitate to say, hey, that's my bag. This is the item that's in there that you might see, and explain what it is if they ask. There's no sense in lying about it or evading. They've seen all kinds of things in bags, and whatever you have in your bag, I'm sure they've seen it before. So merely explain what it is and be clear about it, and they'll go about their merry way. And again, the TSA is all about federal law. So if what you have in your bag may be quite legal in the jurisdiction where you're in, but it's a jurisdiction that's very sensitive about anything firearm-like, the TSA operates on a different set of rules. Just go ahead and tell them what's going on. Common triggers, and I've talked about this a little bit before, basically metallic items, larger items, and oddly shaped items. Those are the things that may cause the X-ray image to come back as something being there. Also, some types of materials may come up differently on some of the screening material machines they have at the airports. So if you have something that has, I don't know, powders or gels in it, smaller gels, of course, because of course large gelled items aren't allowed, it may come back with a funny color in their screen. They might ask you about it. And again, same rules apply. If they ask you about something, tell them what it is. Now we talked about weapons, liquids, gels, and aerosols. That's given in more detail at airsafe.com. But basically, by now, all of you are probably familiar with the liquid rule. You can't carry anything through the screening checkpoint that's greater than about 3 fluid ounces, whether it's a liquid or a gel. Aerosols in a can, same sort of thing. So if you have something in oils and whatnot for oiling the weapon or cleaning fluids and whatnot, if it's small, it'll probably be let through. However, if you have something that the TSA person considers to be a dangerous item, let's say some sort of solvent that might have fume issues with it, it's the judgment of the TSA person, they might confiscate it. Basically, any kind of liquid that's not a hazardous liquid or gel or aerosol can be packed in your luggage. But this is one of those things where if you pack liquids, gels, and aerosols in your luggage, there's always a chance that it might break open or leak because of pressure differences and temperature differences and all that sort of thing. So in general, if you're doing anything, liquids, gels, aerosols, be careful what you do. And if you have an option of getting it at your destination and not worrying about the potential pitfalls, being confiscated, leaking your checked bag, etc., do it at your destination. And again, the one wild card we can't control, no one can control, is the judgment of the screener. Sometimes they have good judgment, sometimes they have bad judgment, and sometimes they're making decisions in the gray area that go against you. So anything you can do to help them out, that'll be great. When it comes to weapons type items, about the only thing that's not allowed in checked baggage are explosives. For example, if you have black powder, not allowed. If you have any other kind of explosive, it's not allowed. Now, what is also unclear is if you have an explosive that's a simulated explosive, again, they are typically banned. But again, depending on what you have, if it's a cartoon looking, dynamite made of plastic, that's one thing. If it's an actual stick of dynamite, no, you can't bring it on board the aircraft. As I've discussed before, one of the worst things that could happen is you have something on you, typically carry on, but sometimes checked, then you have to discard it, ship it, or check it. And you may have something that may not be on TSA's explicitly allowed list. That is, it's probably an innocent item, but it's not one they're familiar with. It's not on their list. It could end up being discarded or confiscated by the TSA. And as I said before, the TSA screener and their supervisor have the final say at the airport. And unless there's something they did that was incorrect or something they did to break your item, you're not going to be reimbursed for your loss. We talked about other common restrictions with liquids, gels, and aerosols, items that could also be used as weapons, and I talked about hand tools and the 7-inch limit. So with the hand tools, basically if you have any metallic item that's over 7 inches long, even if it looks nothing like a tool, nothing like a weapon, the 7-inch rule is sort of like a standard. If it's longer than that and metallic, you could have a problem. So you could have some accessories for your weapons, cleaning accessories, etc. That's longer than 7 inches, made of metal, there could be a problem. If it's not a big hassle, check those items. And just going through what we've discussed before, there are steps you can take ahead of time to keep from getting in trouble. Get familiar with the rules, airline and TSA rules. Get familiar with the appropriate laws where you're traveling. Totally empty out any of your carry-on bags before you travel, and for that matter, your checked luggage if you think there might be things in there that wouldn't be allowed. And if you're traveling in a group of 2 or more, brief everyone else on what's going on. That is, if any one of you are flying with firearms, make sure they understand what the basic rules are. And if they're unclear on those basic rules, school them. Tell them what's going on so you and your traveling party don't get into any problems. Going briefly on the knife rules that are coming up for change in next month. Basically, and this is taken from the TSA's brochure, which in itself is kind of misleading. One page in the brochure said, if the knives have blades shorter than I think it was 2.5 or 2 3/8 inches long, as you can see from the rule on the left. If the blade is less than that length, it's allowed. But if it's a locking blade, or if the handle is molded in some way, it's not allowed. So for example, on the far left, you have a folding blade that's under the length, that's allowed, but it's in one of these molded handle type of situations, so it's not going to be allowed. So even though the TSA is saying you're now going to be allowed some knives on board the airplane in your carry-on luggage, unless it fits their criteria on several dimensions, both the length of the blade, whether or not it's a locking or folding blade, and whether or not the handle is molded, you may not be able to take it in. For example, your classic, I said 2 3/8, is 2.3 inches, 6 centimeters long is the length of the knife. Basically, your classic Swiss Army knife with the shorter blades, those are going to be allowed because it's not a locking blade, it's not a molded handle, and they'll be okay with it. So pocket knives, basic pocket knives are okay. Pretty much anything that's not a basic pocket knife will not be okay. And we saw this picture before. As you can see on the left, we have the classic Swiss Army knife, which is going to be totally allowed, and basically anything else will not be. For example, the first knife has a molded grip and a fixed blade. Second knife, the width of the blade is wider than 1/2 inch. That's another restriction they have. And there's a locking mechanism on the blade. You can't take it. So for those of you who are hunters and have hunting knives with you or knives for dressing deer and what have you, very likely it's not going to be allowed in the passenger cabin. So if you have any kind of utility knife, knife for hunting, knife for use in the field for camping, you probably should be checked. One set of items are still not allowed. You can't do the safety razor blades. You can't do the box cutter type items in the cabin. You can still check them in check luggage, but you can't take them in the cabin. By the way, your disposable razors, they're still allowed in the cabin. Getting back to the tools, I talked about the 7-inch rule. A useful tool, not that I walk around with $100 bills, but all US currency is the same size. So basically, if you have a metallic object that's longer than a dollar bill or a $100 bill, it's probably going to be in violation of the 7-inch tool rule. If it's shorter than a dollar bill, made of metal, it's not a locking knife or whatever, it's probably going to be okay. 3 kinds of possible problems with the new rules, which is basically the same problem with the current rules of the TSA. Confusion on the part of the screeners, who might confiscate something that's totally legal. Confusion on the part of the passenger, who may take something on board, check luggage, or carry-on that shouldn't be there. And differences when you travel outside the country. And again, just be careful where you travel. When I say outside of the country, I would also include outside of your familiar area if you're flying stateside. Again, the rules in Texas are probably a whole lot different from the rules of Massachusetts. So depending on where you're flying, you might want to make yourself familiar, not just for the TSA perspective, but for carrying the firearms out in public once you leave the airport. And reiterating an older point, during the secondary screening of passengers, what happens if an alarm gets triggered? You're going to get a secondary inspection. If it's of the bag, they might open up the bag or run it through the x-ray machine again. If it's you, they might take you to the side for a pat-down search or a metal detector, handheld metal detector, or some other kind of secondary screening device. If you need privacy for some reason, request privacy. If you want to have someone with you observe you being patted down, you can ask for that. If you have a problem with what they're doing, ask for a supervisor. And also, you're pretty much allowed to photograph or film or video someone being patted down. So if one of your party is being searched and you think there's something there that shouldn't be happening, you can take the time to record that, and they shouldn't get in your way on that. So long as you're not interrupting their work, you can photograph people being patted down. For your carry-on bags, this is common sense. No matter what kind of thing you have in your bag, what kind of items are in your bag, keep your bag inside as much as possible. Wrap items that could be a problem in clear plastic or some other easily opened bag or container. When asked, clearly describe what's there. Tell the truth. One trick I use for valuable items, when I have a string of things going through screening, I usually put the most valuable item last, let's say my laptop, in the last bin. So I have some time to go through, go to the other side, and get there before my valuable item comes out of the x-ray machine. If I'm not pulled aside for secondary screening, putting the valuable item last in line in my list of bins and whatnot usually allows me to get there in plenty of time. Now, the problem of TSA employees stealing things, which I talked about earlier. If you can, don't put valuable items in your check bags. You don't have a choice with firearms and firearm pieces, but basically everything else, if you can carry it in carry-on, no problem, carry it in your carry-on. Keep your valuables out of sight. That is, if you're in the airport before you check in and you're at the counter, you have to open up your check bag for some reason, pack your check bag so that your valuable item isn't pretty obvious to passengers around you. Also, if it's going to be checked by the TSA, you don't want to have the very valuable item in your check bag easily seen. I'm not saying be evasive, but hey, if you have something that costs a lot of money, put it under a layer of clothes. So if the TSA agent is lazy, which may go along with TSA agents who are potential thieves, they might open the bag, take a quick look at it, close it, you're done. And identify potential issues. The potential issue could be suspicious people in the terminal. Potential issue could be whatever you think it is a potential issue when it comes to loss or theft by the TSA. For example, if you pulled aside for secondary screening and your valuable items are on one side of the room, you're on the other. If you're traveling in a party of two or more, designate somebody as the person who goes to the bags. That is, someone who's least likely to have a secondary screening, send them through first. They stand by everyone's bags. So if you get pulled aside personally, you'll have somebody you trust with your bags. This is more common sense no matter what you're flying with. If you have fragile items, pack them carefully or put them in your carry-on as well as opposed to check bags. If you have an issue that something might be easily broken if the bag is opened up, tell the TSA screener ahead of time. Count your bags before you go through screening and after you come out the other end, because in all the confusion, you might forget a bag. So if you start with 7, make sure you end up with 7. For that matter, if you end up with 8, make sure you didn't pick up someone else's bag. Keep your check bags, except for those carrying firearms, unlocked. If you have a lost, damaged, missing item or bag, report it immediately to the appropriate person, usually the airline or the TSA, depending on the situation. Now, improper TSA behavior. Incompetence is not an improper behavior, by the way. If the TSA person is drawing attention to your personal items, whether it's your weapon, personal items of other types, that's not something they should do. You have a certain amount of privacy, which you give up by having the TSA look at your bag, but you don't give up the right to having other people know about your private items and your private life. Making inappropriate comments. If the TSA person has a problem with the fact that you like to carry, NRA literature in your bag, they shouldn't be commenting about that to you. That's your personal business, not theirs. Leaving inappropriate messages. In a check bag, if you see the standard TSA document that says, yes, we opened your bag and inspected it, and somebody was foolish enough to write something on there saying, I disagree with all the ammo you're carrying in your bag. Again, that's an inappropriate comment from the TSA. There are procedures you can go through to make sure that person is reprimanded and doesn't do that again. anything else that you think is an unprofessional action on the part of a TSA person. If it's live, you and the TSA person are right there, get a supervisor. If it's after the fact you find out something inappropriate, again, go through the appropriate steps. And the books I mentioned earlier, they have some contact information for you to take that to the right level. And firearms and weapons in check bags, same as for any other kind of items. If it's fragile, pack it carefully. Unless it's a firearm that has to be in a locked bag, leave it in an unlocked bag or one with an approved TSA lock. File the claims if you have a problem. And again, TSA, if they open your bag, will leave a note. Now, it's possible the airline could open your bag for some reason. They may not leave a note for you, but if it's TSA, their standard is leave a note. Now, I already talked about what to do if there's a problem. Supervisors, get witnesses and video and pictures, file a formal complaint, and make others know about it. Others meaning people in your traveling party, others meaning send a letter to the editor or to your organization or whatever to make people aware of things that are not standard that the TSA is doing. International travel, as I mentioned before, laws and rules vary by country. Check with your airline, check ahead of time with the laws of that particular country, and make sure you have whatever documentation you need to take weapons or ammunition or what have you in or out of that country. And just like in the States, if it's something where you can do without it, you can pick it up in country when you get there. Wait till you get in country rather than dealing with it potentially during the trip. For additional information about things dealing with weapons and other packed or carry-on items, go to tsa.airsafe.com. Got plenty of links, including links to information about firearms, and you can download the Fear of Flying guide among other guides that we have. We may have throw in a couple of extra TSA type brochures as well, based on what we talked about today. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our attendees. David, you were kind to us earlier by giving us your comments. The floor is open to you. Do you have anything that you'd like to add or any questions you'd like to have answered? Claire?
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation. And I'm sorry there weren't a whole lot more people that were able to make it. But
circumstances.
I jotted down a few questions along the way. One was about air guns, like CO2-powered pellet guns and BB guns, things like that. I presume those would be treated pretty much the same as firearms, but perhaps would not need to be in a hard side case.
That's correct.
But they would have to be checked.
That is my interpretation, because although I didn't see specifics about hard-sided cases for BB guns, I have seen very specific things on the TSA website that says BB guns, air guns, etc. must be in checked luggage. So that's for sure. Okay. The cartridges for an air gun, the CO2 cartridge, if it's empty, you can have it in checked luggage. But if it's compressed air, a charged up, compressed air bottle, you cannot have those in checked or carry on.
Next question was there was a slight confusion when you first talked about the type of lock to have on a hard side checked-in bag that has a firearm in it. It just needs to be a TSA approved lock so they can unlock it?
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out, because I was kind of confused when I was talking during the webinar myself. There are two kinds of lock situations here. On checked bags that do not have firearms, they suggest you keep it unlocked, or if you have to lock it, there's a certain set of locks that TSA approves, or TSA basically has a master key, where you can lock it, they can unlock it. That's one thing. When it comes to the hard-sided case, this is a key that you have to provide typically to the airline, so the TSA can do whatever they can to open it up. So it doesn't have to be a TSA-approved lock, but you do have to provide the key. And for those specifics, I highly recommend going to the airline, because the airline may have very specific rules as to what kind of lock and what kind of key or how many keys you have to have.
Oh, I see. So you actually typically have to provide a key to the airline at the check-in counter?
Well, let me warn you. This is my interpretation of the rules as looked at by the TSA, because the airline and the TSA have to be able to open up that case and look at it. So whether it's done at the check-in counter itself, whether it's done behind the check-in counter, that depends on the airline's procedures. For whatever reason, they may actually have you check in a hard-sided case at something other than the usual check-in counter. And again, every airline's different. Call ahead. And
That answers it.
that also goes for picking it up. For example, if you have golf clubs or skis, they usually have some airports have a separate special area where you have large and oversized items. They may or may not do that for firearms and hard-sided cases. Talk with the airline.
Okay. Just a thought that came to mind during the presentation. Digital photography is so easy nowadays, and most people have cameras on their cell phones even. And it seemed like a useful thing if you were carrying anything valuable, whether in carry-on luggage or checked in, to take some digital photographs of things as they're packed in the suitcase, perhaps.
Absolutely,
Um,
for
yeah,
insurance purposes and for reimbursement purposes. If you have
yeah,
something valuable that's checked, especially firearms, document it with photographs or anything else so that if they're lost or damaged because of the airlines or TSA's mistakes, they'll reimburse you. And this is something I
yeah,
didn't go into during the webinar. There are restrictions as to the amount you'll be reimbursed for checked luggage being lost or damaged. So if it's a $100 gun, it's one thing. If it's a $10,000 gun, no, they're not going to reimburse you for that. There's a limit depending on each bag, and again, talk with your airline. If you have something extremely valuable, antique, rare, etc., you may want to get supplemental insurance of some kind to cover loss, damage, or misplacement by the airline during flight.
hmm Okay. All right. Well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Those are the only questions that I had at this point.
Well, I thank you for being here today, and thank you for contributing. Not often do we get folks who both listen and contribute. And when I splice the show together, I'll make sure that most, if not all, of your questions end up in there.
Well, thanks very much again, Todd. I really appreciate it, and I think you have a great website. AirSafe has been very helpful.
Well,
I
thank you for that.
I read all the emails I get from you.
Yes, indeed. And we hope to keep up and running for years to come. And thank you all for attending this webinar. And this is Dr. Todd Curtis of AirSafe.com signing off.